that in any classroom, it is the first 20-25 minutes of the subject when somebody hears it and responds to it. The memory of that experience remains for a long time, and that is how the subject matter is grasped well. With this background, we in IFCO Tokyo thought of starting a series of meetings with you. Especially, we have named it as Masterclass because we have a master teacher amongst us, Uttara Vaid, who has been a specialist in the liability sector. With her, of course, we have our team member, Garima Kripesh, who handles the daily routine of proposals from all of you. And we have chosen some interesting parts within liability in terms of certain sections where there is generally a lot of ambiguity. For instance, even today, after so many years, we talk about occurrence-based policy and claims-made policy, and people still are in the area where people do get confused. What is the difference between these two? So today, in the bite-size program, Uttara and Garima have chosen some very interesting parts of the liability policy, which will help you to face a client and explain to them what are the advantage of these small sections, which may otherwise seem to cover in their sentence everything. But people do misinterpret it in other ways. So these bite-sized programs, I hope, will help you to understand the subject better and also satisfy your clients on the usefulness of these conditions. So with these words, again, thanking all of you to be good participants and having joined us. I leave the floor open to Uttara Vaid to start the session. And at the end of the session, there will be question answer sessions for which Preet and Garima will coordinate and try and put up the relevant questions to Uttara. And you will be getting satisfactory answers through her also. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Rajaraman, and thank you, ITGI, for giving us this platform to discuss and debate. This is not, whilst we are calling it a master class, basically I'll be speaking max for 15-20 minutes. As Mr. Rajaraman explained, we are going to take up fundamentals of insurance, liability insurance to be specific, and we are going to concentrate on things that we don't often look at when we are comparing quotes from various insurers. So what we are going to do is concentrate, bring back the technical into deal making. I see today, the atmosphere in business is all about making a deal. I got this deal, I clinched this business. That's all fine. But are we truly understanding what we mean, what the insurer means when he uses certain terminology? So the idea is to concentrate on one particular topic. Today we have chosen the topic which is basis of claims handling, and we are going to look at duty to defend versus what you call duty to indemnify. It is also called reimbursement basis of claims handling. I don't necessarily call it the right to defend, and we will get into reasons why I don't call it so. So maximum I'm hoping that, in fact I've got only 3-4 slides, and maximum I'm hoping that I will enunciate and elucidate these principles for 15 to 20 minutes, after which the floor will be open to all of you. So feel free to ask as many questions, obviously on the topic, on duty to defend, on maybe a hybrid. If you have seen any other type of claims handling, hybrid claims handling, where the insurer says I have the right but not the duty, so he's walking the middle ground. So whatever, I mean, wherever you find a question that you have been wanting to ask, not knowing where to ask or where to find the correct solution, this is your platform. So this is your forum. We look forward to a very participative audience. We look forward to people asking all kinds of questions. And at what will give us the ultimate satisfaction is that people, when they leave the meeting, will say, okay, we understood this concept enough to be able to use it themselves, or enough to be able to answer questions when they are facing a client. So let's begin. Today is the first series, and we'll look forward to your feedback as well, as to what topics we should consider in future, whether you like this format. So feel free with the feedback as well later. So let's begin this without much ado. Garima, can you change the slide, please? So let us start. I mean, liability for me has always been a fun thing. I always get amazed when people get intimidated by liability insurance. So let us start on a lighter note. Is this what you guys often think, when you're looking at and all these thought bubbles? So I've just coined a small poem. So let's start with a poem. Pray, will somebody tell me what is reimbursement vis-a-vis duty to defend? The language of liability insurance is so hard to comprehend. Now, is it a claim? Is a claim when an accident occurs or when a claim is made? Will somebody explain the difference between occurrence and claims made? And if you could shed a little light on deductibles, retentions, and excess, I might understand liability insurance with a little more success. Now, if this is going on in your mind, that what is a retention and what is an SIR and what is occurrence based, what is a right to defend, what is duty to defend, then this masterclass is for you. Can we go to the next slide, please? So let us go to the absolute basics. What is duty to defend? Now, most people say in India, this is a duty to defend policy, and in contradistinction, they say this is a right to defend policy. Hold your horses here. The duty to defend wording normally comes like this: insurer has a right as well as a duty to defend the insured in the event of a claim. So you see, the policy wording is insurer has a right as well as a duty to defend. So is it a right to defend? Is it a duty to defend? Now you need to really go into the concept, into the basic concept, and understand what is meant. Oh, everybody is getting the beep, my dear, but I think it's people coming in a little late. So you're right. There is a very persistent beep coming, but that is because people are entering still, and I hope that this beep goes off once everybody who's interested has entered. So let's come back to the basics. That insurer has a right as well as a duty to defend. Now, mostly if you were to use this duty to defend in contradistinction to duty to indemnify, if those were the words you use, then you would get the drift of it better. What is duty to defend? In a third party liability policy, if the insurer says it is my duty to defend you, what does he mean? He means that if you have a claim, give me notice of the claim and I take over the defense. I will take over the defense. So obviously the insurer is stepping into your shoes. He is treating that, okay, I have given him a policy where this incident might be covered, and therefore after an initial check of the policy, he sees that yes, this would form a covered element or a coverage that is granted under the policy. He then takes over the duty to defend you. Now you would say, why would he do that? And on the in contrast is a duty to indemnify, where the insurer says in his operative clause sometimes that it is my duty to indemnify you for damages and defense costs that you incur or that the insured incurs in defending the claim. So these are the way the policy language is drafted. In a duty to defend, you give the notice of the claim to the insurer then starts defending, which means that he starts appointing the lawyer to defend you. If this is in a foreign jurisdiction, let's say this is a product liability claim in an offshore country, in a country where the policy has not been issued. So if the policy is issued in India with worldwide territory and jurisdiction, and this is a claim in Europe, in Spain, take any country for that matter. Now, if you say, if it is the insurer's duty to defend, then he appoints the legal counsel or the defense counsel in Spain. Let's take for example that the country from where the claim has originated is Spain. So he appoints the defense counsel there. Now, when the insurer appoints a defense counsel, who pays the fees? The insurer pays the fees. Again, you would ask me that are the fees included in the limit of indemnity? Will the fees that you pay for defense be set off against the limits of indemnity? Again, depends on the policy wording. In India, we have seen that even though insurers are giving a duty to defend, they say this is a cost inclusive, defense cost included in the limits of indemnity. which means that if they appoint a counsel, defense lawyer, the fees that he is going to charge you are still going to get debited from the limits of indemnity. But the insurer is overseeing this entire operation. He knows that this is a covered claim. So he ensures that the defense costs are kept to a minimum. He ensures that if there is a quick settlement, it is done and you're out of it. He ensures that the entire claim is minimized. Now, think about this a little more deeply than just the claim. If you have, let's say, a claim, let's say you are, I mean, all of you are brokers, but if you're insured, if you're insured has a claim of $100,000 from Spain. Now, let's say that the insurer has given you a duty to defend. He now is defending you. He knows that if the claim is magnified or the claim, the settlement goes larger, it is going to come out of his money because the insured has paid the premium and he's the one handling the claim. So it is in his interest also to keep the claim cost to the minimum. Now, and after all this, he sort of appoints a best lawyer, gets you a judgment. The initial claim was $100,000, but he's been able to effect a settlement for your insured at $55,000 or $60,000. How does it help the insured? Can you imagine going for the renewal of this policy with a $60,000 claim vis-a-vis a $100,000 claim? So, duty to defend is a fantastic provision in its when it is observed to the hilt, because it keeps the, and I'll tell you how it keeps the defense cost down also. It keeps the defense cost down. It the insurer starts paying for the claim, so it's not like a reimbursement policy where the insured is handling the appointment of the lawyer, he's paying the lawyer. In a long length litigation country like ours, the defense cost itself can be, the annualized defense cost itself for a claim that's going to last 3-4 years are going to be a lot more. So here, and the CFO looks at it from this point of view, that the insurance company is starting to pay the claim by paying the defense costs. So he knows that he doesn't have to apply to the RBI to send money from here to find a lawyer for the insured to find a lawyer, an appropriate lawyer in a foreign country where he's not used to the legal process. So the insured thinks that this is in fact, I must tell you that in 2001, when we introduced the duty to defend wording and the CGL wording, there were plenty CFOs who appreciated the fact that their monies, they can, the claim is being handled by the insurer, and they can, they don't lose the opportunity cost of money that would have been spent in this litigation. So there are a lot of pluses to duty to defend. Reimbursement basis, the insured has to defend himself. If you look at in contradistinction to duty to defend, there is reimbursement basis, or where the insurer tells the insured that it is my duty to indemnify you. You handle the entire legal proceeding. When you come to a judgment and out of court settlement, we will pay for the judgment or the verdict if there are any damages awarded against you, and we will pay for the defense costs that you have incurred until that date. So the whole bill is then sorted out by the insured, presented to the insurer, and the insurer looks at that bill and settles that, hopefully. Ideal situation. That is what you call the reimbursement basis of claims handling. Both of them will have the pros and cons. We will discuss that in the next slide. But one pertinent question that every time when I talk about duty to defend, everybody asks me is, in a duty to defend policy, who does the insurer appointed lawyer work for? Remember the litigation, the case is against the insured, but the insurer has appointed the defense lawyer. So who does this defense lawyer work for? The defense lawyer in this type of a scenario always works for the insured, because even though the insurer is seen to be paying the fees, they are always deducted in a cost inclusive. Remember, in a cost inclusive policy, they will be deducted from the limits of indemnity. So, regardless of who is immediately paying the fees, who is bearing the cost of defense, it is the insured who's bearing the cost of defense. Therefore, the lawyer is supposed to work for him. Now, again, this may open a Pandora's box. Uh, uh, the insured may at times feel that the lawyer is working more for the insurer than for his rights. In such a case, the insured can ask for a coverage counsel. He can ask for, I mean, he has to make out a case for conflict of interest. He can ask for another lawyer. The cost of this lawyer, coverage counsel, or the cost of another lawyer in a conflict of interest situation is always borne by the insurer and not set off against the limits of indemnity. So, and this is the way it has to work. Think about it logically. Let's say that you've got the insured has got a claim of $5 million. The policy limits are only $2 million. Now, if the case stretches out and those $2 million of limits of indemnity are over, the insurer will walk out. But the same lawyer continues to handle the litigation on behalf of the insured now. He's always been doing it on behalf of the insured, but now all the more he represents the insured. If this were not the case, then imagine how it would be in real life scenarios. What it would mean is that the insurer is walking out with his lawyer if the lawyer is working for the insurer. So, in order to guard against such possibilities, it is always the case that even though the policy may be on a duty to defend wording, the lawyer appointed by the insurer works for the insured. Now, many policies carry a hammer clause or a consent to settlement clause, also known as a blackmail clause. In both types of policies, whether you're looking at reimbursement policies or duty to defend policies, there would be a hammer clause. And if you want to understand the hammer clause, think about, I mean, if all of you have seen Hindi film courtroom dramas, you will know the hammer that a judge wields, right? And he's the one who's sort of pounding the desk with his hammer and saying, order, order. And imagine that scene. Imagine the hammer in that scene. So, it is this hammer that the insurer, let's say the insurer is handling the case. He comes to a point where he thinks it's pointless to go on and on. I think my insured is at a fault. If I offer some compensation or offer a settlement now, the claimant is going to accept it and I'm going to be out of this particular litigation. Now, he goes to the insured and tells him that, listen, I think we are at fault. I mean, the insured is at fault. I think the policy will pay. I don't want to drag this on for too long because the defense costs are anyway going to cost me only, the insurer. So, why don't we call the claimant for a settlement? Now, imagine. Fault. I'm not going to accept a judgment. And though nowadays all judgments and settlements are worded without accepting any guilt on the part of the insured and, language like that. But there are times when the insured says, no, I want to fight this case. I'm not going to agree to settling this case with the claimant, even though you think you can. That's when the hammer clause, the hammer is wielded by the insurer. He says, enough. I'm going to settle. I know that the claimant will settle for so much. I know that if I make this offer within a week, the settlement amount is going to be so much. It's going to be an out of court settlement. I know the defense costs are so much up to this date, and I'm going to give you this money and I'm walking out of it. Whatever damages, whatever defense costs that are incurred on this case, after I have wielded my hammer privilege, are all at the insurer's expense. That is what is called the hammer clause. Jokes, when you're joking about, in liability insurance, there would be a number of jokes. I always told you this is a very, very interesting field. We always call it the blackmail clause. The insurer is now blackmailing you that either agree to what I'm saying or I'm walking out. If that sounds a lot like your better half, then sorry, but that's the way it is. So that is so look out for a hammer clause, which will never be. Now, the best part about this clause is that it will never be titled in the policy as a hammer clause. There are plenty times when I tell the insurers that, look, you have a hammer clause in the policy, and they say, where? There are plenty times when I tell the brokers, don't agree to a hammer clause, and they say, where? I can't see a hammer clause. It will never be titled as such. Coming back to the reimbursement basis of claims handling, remember, you might think when you look at a reimbursement basis that the insured has to handle the whole case himself, he has to appoint the lawyer, he has to go to court, it may be long length litigation, he has to pay for the legal fees. But remember, it's not as hands off as you would like to believe. Every liability claim
Hello.
Uttara, you have gone offline. Are you able to hear me? Hello.
Sir, I'll just check with her.
Yeah, please. I think she has gone offline suddenly. Maybe it's some connectivity issue. Thanks for your patience, participants. We are sorry, there is some technical glitch here. We're just trying to get it sorted out. Garima, you will also have to tell where she got off air suddenly so that she continues with the right pace.
Sir, she is just reconnecting. There was a
Yeah.
She can see herself connected, but she didn't realize that she's on off.
Yeah,
She's
maybe she has
just-
to start talking about the off air went.
Sure, sir. So she is coming back.
On a lighter vein, there's a typical blackmail clause. She's walking out of it.
Hi, can you all see and hear me now?
We can hear you, Uttara.
Mhm.
Probably at this stage, hearing you is more important. But
I can so
yeah. I request you somewhere went off air at the hammer clause. So from there, probably you'll have to start and go on with the example.
Oh dear. Okay, so on the hammer clause, coming back to the hammer clause, it's also known as the blackmail clause because the insurer then says that, look, I can settle it at this point. These are the defense costs. Oh God, am I off again? Hey, who's giving me this co-hosting right?
No, we are able to hear you. You're absolutely fine.
Okay, fair enough. So at this point in time, the insurer says that I can settle it at this point of time with the claimant. I've got the claimant ready to accept and give me a full and final discharge. These are the defense costs which have been incurred so far. So if you want to carry on with this litigation, feel free, but I am settling. I'm using the hammer. I'm settling this case. I mean, I'm paying off to you as much as I think I can settle with the claimant plus the defense costs incurred until this stage. And that is when the insurer walks out of the litigation after making an offer to the insured to accept it. If the insured demurs, he is hesitant, he denies this offer, he refuses to accept this offer, then the insurer puts his hammer down in the sense he obligates him to accept this offer, mandates it on him, and the insured is left with no choice. This is what is called a hammer clause. Coming back to reimbursement basis of handling a claim, please understand, everybody, much as you think that in a reimbursement kind of policy, let's say the claim is on the insured has to appoint a lawyer, he has to fight the entire litigation and then claim the defense, plus if there are any damages awarded against him from the insurer, then you're missing an important ingredient here. An important protocol in the whole claims handling process is that you keep the insurer informed at every stage. I cannot tell you the number of liability claims that fall by the wayside because the notice of the claim has not been given to the insurer. This is in the reimbursement basis, right? In the duty to indemnify kind of policy wording, where the insurer has said it's only my duty to indemnify you. Even there, you've got to give the insurer notice of claim. You've got to take his prior approval of the appointment of the lawyer you wish to appoint. You've to give him a statement of estimate of legal fees that are going to be incurred for him handling this case. And the insurer has to be kept informed. So it's not a hands-off approach from the insurer. And I must caution, put you all on guard, especially the brokers who are advising the insured, that please follow these steps. Almost all, and I see, there are times when I see it from the insured's point of view. From the insured, if there is especially a D&O claim, the insurer manager or the compliance or the company secretary or whoever in the company is handling the claim is told to keep it confidential. This should not go out in the market. Your insurer is not the market. If you intend to claim in the policy, please inform him and follow the appropriate procedure. There is ever so often that we find that in a reimbursement basis also, people will wait till the, they won't even say that in the renewal, they will wait, they'll say we've got a retro date. Hang on, you need to tell the insurer, especially before the expiry of the policy. 2-3 years down the claim, they come back, tell the insurer, and expect the claim payment to be smooth. Doesn't work like that. Let's go to the next slide, Garima. So pros of duty to defend. Everything has a pro and con, right? Advantage, disadvantage.
I will just take a small time. I think whatever we have discussed so far, this slide is where probably we put the whole discussion into perspective, and the pros and cons become very, very important. And if we can spend some time on this, it'll be really useful.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. So what are the pros of duty to defend? Insurers' legal expertise is available. Let's say you are a chemical company. Your expertise, the insured is a chemical company. His expertise is where? His expertise is in producing chemicals. There is a product liability claim on him. He does not know how to handle the lawyers. His company secretary, legal department is also looking at other points. They're not looking at claims for compensation. Whereas for the insurance company, since they keep selling liability policies, they are used to doing this. So the insurer's expertise comes to the advantage of the insured. Keeps the cost of the claim down. In a good duty to defend scenario, okay? Again, I repeat, good duty to defend performance and claims handling by the insurer. The cost of the claim is driven down. How does that happen? The insurer is now looking at, the insurer, remember, is dispassionate. Whilst the insured may feel offended about a particular claim, especially if that's on the D&O side, or if that's, but on the D&O side, you don't even have a duty to defend. So where some EPLI policies I've seen are on duty to defend basis, So if there are, then the insured feels very sensitive, his sensitivities are heightened. The insurer has a dispassionate thing. He knows whether there is going to be legal liability attaching to the claim. He knows when I can push for a settlement. Because the insurer is used to settling the claims on a duty to defend basis in terms of appointment of lawyers, you know what they do? They have a panel of lawyers ready, and because they are bringing that lawyer a significant book of claims, they have negotiated down the defense costs. So because they have negotiated down the defense cost, if even company ABC were to appoint the same lawyer, the fees from the same lawyer are going to be much more than the fees that the lawyer will charge the insurer. Eventually, this is going to be added to your claim. So you're keeping the costs of the claim significantly down. Home court advantage. Now, what is home court advantage? You know how they always say in cricket that if you are playing in the home country, then the fans are cheering you on, motivating you on. There's a home court advantage. In legal liability, what is home court advantage? It means that, let's say I gave you an initial example that the claim is in Spain. Now, in a duty to defend scenario, the insurer finds a legal counsel in Spain, a Spaniard, who is going to handle the case in his country. He knows how the legal process in Spain works. So he is bringing the expertise. You may have, insured may have the best lawyers here, but they are Indian lawyers, very good indeed, but they are Indian lawyers. Compare that with a lawyer in Spain who's handling the account. So it brings all the expertise of local lawyers into a claim situation wherever it may have happened. And insurer starts paying the defense costs. I told you that the insurer will, because he's appointing the lawyer in duty to defend, he starts paying the defense cost to the lawyer. And for most CFOs, they love it because they think that the claim is already starting to get paid. Secondly, they know that they are not missing out on the opportunity cost of funds. They would have had to find these funds from their own kitty, instead of which the insurer is paying. Now, again, whether this will be debited against your limit or set off against your limit of liability depends entirely on whether you have a cost in addition policy or defense costs within the limits of liability. In India, let me assure you, defense costs are mostly done within the limit of liability. What are the disadvantages of a duty to defend? Does not lend itself to personal claims. So I remember when we were talking about the duty to defend it, and I was an insurer, people used to come and tell me, Uttara, we want the directors and officers policy also on a duty to defend. I said, how does that work? Because a director, when he's sued in his personal capacity, he will want himself to handle the litigation. He will not want the insurance company to say, you appoint this lawyer. He'll say, hang on, I just want defense costs, but I want the lawyer of my choice. And that should be permitted also, because sometimes certain decisions the lawyers have taken after consulting their legal counsel. So obviously they will want that firm to defend themselves. So it lends itself to claims which are brought against the company. But normally for personal claims, you don't give a duty to defend. In fact, duty to defend is given more on CGL casualty lines than on financial lines. Having said that, as I mentioned, I have still seen, even this day and age, I sometimes see errors and omissions on duty to defend basis. I think we moved out of duty to defend for errors and omissions in 2005, 2006, and I will tell you the reasons why. And there are times when I see it for EPLI, but otherwise I see it mainly in the casualty side. Now, client is more aware of technical issues, and this is one of the reasons why most insurers started giving, especially IT errors and omissions. They didn't want a duty to defend the insurers because the client exactly knew. Now comes the flip side of the coin. The insurer does not know IT as much as the client knows. The insured knows. The insured knows whether there has been deficiency in service. The insured knows how to remedy it. The insured can put up technical arguments which are the best arguments in their defense. The insurer does not know that. So when it's a question of legal expertise, you might want to look at this reimbursement type of policy. It may not be well received by the top customers of the client. Again, there is a flip side to it, you know. There are times when it may not be, you have a customer who gives you a substantial portion of the revenue. He says, you've given me a bad product or a deficient service. And you say, hang on, I have a duty to defend policy. My insurer is going to argue with you. This may not be well received by your top customer. He may want you to be handling the negotiation, not your insurer. So it can be misinterpreted at times. There are times when customers have used it instead of arguing with their best customer, where the insureds have used it to their advantage, instead of arguing with their best customers on whether they have been at fault or no. They've just said that, look, I have a duty to defend, the insurer is going to defend me, and let's take it from there. If the insurer says I've been at fault, and they will then settle the claim. If not, then let's look for a way forward. So it works both ways. And again, duty to defend does not allow for self-handling of small claims. So if you have a duty to defend policy and you want to handle small claims, you will have to get into an express MOU with the insurance company that claims below my retention, claims which are up to 10% of the limit of indemnity, and the claims that I don't intend to take from you, I should be allowed to handle myself. Because in a classic duty to defend, you do not have this liberty. Whatever claim, even if the claims, there's some policies, I don't see this wording in Indian policies, but some policies abroad will have, even if the claim be groundless, fraudulent, false, it will still be handled by the insurer. So I think I'm at the end of my brief. It wasn't brief, I'm sorry, but you get me started on liability insurance. This always happens. I have overshot my time, but I can now take on questions and answers on this particular issue.
Thank you, Uttara. Garima, you want to take it over?
Yes, sir. So if anybody has any questions, please put it in the chat box and we will address those questions from there.
Garima, can I address it without writing? This is Madhuri.
Yes, sure, ma'am. Please do.
Okay. See, Uttara explained duty to defend and reimbursement. Now, what I want to know that are there wordings in the market which are without duty to defend clause?
Yes, most policies that we do here are non-duty to defend, where, and I sometimes see a hybrid wording also, that we have the right but not the duty. Now, I'm not in favor of this wording, because if you want to use hybrid wording like this, the insurer has to make clear that when does he want to invoke the right. You can't have a wording which says I have a right but not the duty. So when a claim happens, all parties are confused that who's handling the claim. If the insurer has a right, is he handling the claim? He does not have the duty, so does he expect the insured to handle the claim? It has to be spelled out. Unfortunately, I see hybrid wording, but not the later spelling out in the claims handling provision that who is to take the lead in responding to the claim at the start. Because reimbursement policies also have a right. They invest the right in the insurer. In a reimbursement wording, there will always be a clause which states that whilst the insured is handling the claim by himself, if at any point of time the insurer thinks that the claim is going awry, the insurer thinks that this is going to result in a magnified settlement because the defense counsel is not handling it properly, they can invoke their right to defend the claim. They can step in and say, okay, I'm now handling the claim, my way.
Normally none of us read the policies in detail, so I'm not disputing what you are saying. But when we do RFQ and blah, 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 we always take duty to defend, and the response is always yes by the insurers where we are taking quotes. So I really don't know, one needs to pay attention to anything more than that in the wordings once the insurance company has agreed to duty to defend clause.
See, if the insurance company has agreed to the duty to defend in the RFQ, remember, can I call you Madhuri?
Of course.
So remember, Madhuri, it is your duty to check with the insurer how they are going to discharge that duty. It is your duty to check with the insurer as to whether they have the requisite expertise. Now, there are times if the insurer is bound by, a lot of bureaucracy within his organization. By giving him a duty to defend, what are you doing? It always depends on your choice of insurer. If this guy is going to go through red tape and bureaucracy in trying to get somebody saying yes you can defend and yes you can appoint a lawyer, and this itself is going to take a long time, that will work to the disadvantage of your client, of the insured. So understand what is duty to defend. Look at the insurer who promises you that I'm going to give you a duty to defend, and then see whether it works out to the benefit of your client. That's why I discussed the advantages and the disadvantages.
Uttara, I will just put the perspective of an insurer, a practicing insurer. There are two things here, Madhuri, that we'll have to see. Is there an echo? Everybody's getting an echo. Hello?
Now you're better.
Yeah, sorry. Hello? Are you able to hear me?
We are still getting.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
See, primarily duty to defend is not to be seen as a showstopper. What we are trying to say is an average customer is not here to deal with claims. And as insurers, the kind of exposure that we have across the country and across the globe, like Uttara gave you an example of a product liability or anything, the wherewithal and the background knowledge of similar cases is available at the insurer's hands. So when we are talking of on the average clients, their shoulders are free once an incident happens. What we are talking in the other side is large corporations, very large corporations who have a battery of lawyers who do certain things with certain legal ramifications. Now there people may have their own choice to happen with. So there is run-of-the-mill clients, which is usually in a liability, it is up to 90% of the clients. A simple manufacturer. If suppose your jurisdiction is only going to be in India, it's absolutely fine. You know the local people. But when you go across overseas, then the insurance company's presence there, their networking helps you in many ways to understand those legal norms as well. In some of the countries, you cannot present yourself directly as an insurer unless you take a barrister. But the insurance companies then come in and reduce the cost. I think that is where the real cost reduction is taking place, because there is a battery of known network already available. Wherever very sensitive cases happen.
So what you are saying for overseas, I fully agree. But within India, the client always will have a choice of a lawyer, their past experience. So then in that case, when they want to evoke duty to defend, and if they come up with a suggestion to the insurance company, are you all willing to hear?
Suggestion of a lawyer is always there. There is the duty of defense does not say it will be X lawyer or Y lawyer. It only says that keep us in picture and we would like to vet it from day one so that we know the case is going on the right side. And insurance companies do that because we
Rajaraman, that would be in the reimbursement type, where keep us informed, you handle your defense and you handle your litigation. Duty to defend, classic, I'm talking about classic duty to defend. The insurer can put his foot down and say, sorry, you will use my lawyer.
That option is available. I'm not at all saying that. What I am trying to say is, if there is enough reasoning happening, it will be. Garima, next question.
Okay, and the second thing, this hammer clause, that also you need to read the wordings of duty to defend only. If there is something like this, you'll be able to find out when you read the clause in the policy.
Madhuri, that is not always in duty to defend. In fact, in the duty to defend policies, you may not find a hammer clause, but in a reimbursement policy, I've often seen this.
And for example, can you tell us any one insurer who's using the reimbursement wordings in the market?
Everybody is using the reimbursement wording. Everybody's policy reads, unless, see, I'll tell you this. Tata AIG does CGL with a duty to defend wording. There are many insurers, the public sector insurers do that. I will indemnify the insured. When the wording reads that the insurer will indemnify the insured for damages and defense costs, it is reimbursement wording. Where the wording reads that it is the insurer's right and duty to defend, that means it's duty to defend.
No, so I'm only learning with this because I've always taken duty to defend in my RFQs, and answer is yes, and placing the business and going ahead. So that's why I asked you this question, where what are the insurers who are taking reimbursement? Yes, public sector could be. I don't do business with public sector.
Ma'am,
No, there are
mostly
plenty
all the
private
companies.
insurers. Yeah, sorry, go
Yes,
ahead.
ma'am,
Garima.
there are plenty of companies, almost all who offer policies on reimbursement basis.
Okay.
RFQ, the intermediary asks for a duty to defend, then they
Yes.
may say that yes, we can provide this cover. But by default, for which we will have to pass an endorsement. But by default, the policies are mostly on reimbursement basis, or like ma'am said, right to defend is another word for that.
All right. Understood. Thanks. I have no more questions.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, there is another question.
Can you
What
read
is
that
this?
out to me?
Yes, ma'am. What is the start point of duty to defend clause? Example, at times, insured just inform the incident of an incident which may actually not result in a claim.
That's fine. Duty to defend classic means that as soon as you get a notice, you inform the insurer. Because it's his duty to defend you. So you can't have a duty to defend, and that is a real, I tell you, that's a real problem, because people ask for duty to defend policies, and then when a claim actually happens, they don't inform the insurer, they appoint their own lawyers, and I'm like, you asked for a duty to defend, didn't you? So why aren't you using what you actually asked for and what you actually wanted? So if you're asking for a duty to defend policy, it starts when you receive the notice of the claim.
So whether it is duty to defend or reimbursement, I think the notification should go to the insurer the moment you receive the claim. So that notification should not get delayed because of the nature of the policy.
That would be ideal, Garima. But at least in the reimbursement, the policy wording would say that you have to inform as soon as is reasonably practicable, and definitely before the end of the expiry period.
Yes, ma'am.
But
Ma'am,
it
we have
helps
a-
in both cases, because I agree with you, Garima. It helps in both cases, because if even in a reimbursement type of policy, if you want the insurance company to pay defense costs, isn't it your duty to get the approval of the defense lawyer that you have appointed with his estimate of fees?
Right, ma'am. We have another question asking the insurer in India offer E&O policies on duty to defend clause. In that case, can the insured have a MOU to employ his counsel?
I see errors and omissions. Most insurers have moved out of duty to defend. Most insurers. There are a few in London who still do errors and omissions on a duty to defend. But errors and omissions, I think the industry experience has also been that reimbursement type of duties, basis of claims handling are very important, because then the client handles that particular issue, especially if the services that he provides are very technical in nature.
Right, ma'am. Ma'am, there is one question which says that there are many liability policies available like DNO, CGL, product, professional indemnity, and so on. Can we have a slide in which it shortly explains so that we can suggest the best perfect policy? So for this, this is a question from Mitul Shah. So Mitul, I think we'll get in touch with you separately and take you through all the policies. I is what you're trying to ask. If this is in relation to duty to defend or company reimbursement, you can please ask the question again, because I thought what I can understand is you want to have a slide on each one of this product, which we can definitely have that separately. Ma'am, there is another question which says, can a consent to settle rights be can a consent to settle rights granted to the insured? What will be the effect on premium?
Can a consent to settle? The hammer clause is often called a consent to settle. So the insurer asks a consent to settle, but he does not intend to wait until the consent. So normally it will be worded with the consent to settle type of wording, where the insurer will say that we will seek your consent when we think that it's time to settle, and if you disagree, we will offer to pay until then the damages plus defense costs, and that's it. That's a hammer clause.
I think, Uttara, this is the other way around. Can the insured settle it without the consent of the insurer, and what
Oh,
effect it would
wow.
have on the premium?
That's what he
Interesting one.
means. Acha, okay, sorry, I misunderstood.
Yeah.
Okay, so most reimbursement type of wording. See, in a duty to defend, the insured has no discretion in settling any claim. So I would presume that this question concentrates on the reimbursement type of policies. In a reimbursement type of policy, all policies that I've seen will have that no insured can consent to, can effect a settlement or can consent to liability or admit or settle any liability without the consent of the insurer. I have not seen any insurer give up this right even on payment of additional premium. I can stand corrected if any of my esteemed colleagues here have got that from any insurance company. Because most insurers do not give up this right.
I would just like to go to a conventional policy and explain it. Once it's a reimbursement place, then after the duties are done, even in those policies, the duty to keep the insured informed exists. And therefore, any intervention has to be on time. And if a consent is given by policy terms and conditions, the claim would be reviewed and decision can go this way or that way. So no consent is given very clearly.
Yes, it's a process of consultation in every claim. You can't ask for, I'm willing to pay you so much premium, but give me the consent to settle. I've not heard of that negotiation yet.
Ma'am, the next question is, which all liability policies are eligible for duty to defend?
We often see duty to defend in casualty. As I mentioned, in America, there are people who do EPLI policies. I've seen EPLI policies on duty to defend. Employment practice liability insurance, right? I've seen those in financial lines which are on duty to defend. Very, very, very select insurers now give errors and omissions on duty to defend, but otherwise I would suggest that for the purpose of understanding it here in India, consider casualty CGL policies on duty to defend and consider D&O and financial lines policies on a reimbursement type of claims handling. This is very general, but it will help you. Consider this as your thumb rule. But read the policy. I will go back to what Madhuri said, that we don't read all this in the policy wording. If you are at doubt, if you're ever having doubts, read the basis of claims handling. There will be specific paragraphs in each policy about claims handling.
Garima, a lot of questions are coming, so just see on the time limit, and if you can note down the questions, and we definitely will take down the replies and reply to all of you individually as well. Go ahead, Garima. Hello? Garima, are you there?
I think Garima is
Okay, Preet?
not audible.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, ma'am. So, ma'am, next question is, how does deductible get triggered in a duty to defend wording?
Excellent question. Beautiful question, I must say. Now, see what happens in a duty to defend. Duty to defend means the insurer is settling your claim. So, invariably, I will just share a small hint here. When policies begin that the insurer pays on behalf, the pay on behalf language means that the insurer is going to probably use duty to defend because he is paying on behalf to the direct claimant. So if the insurer is discharging the duty to defend, paying on behalf of the insured to the direct claimant, he obviously can't deduct the deductible. So it will be paid, and then from the defense cost he will have to pay. From that he will deduct the deductible directly to the insured. But when the claim is settled with the claimant, the deductible does not come into play in a duty to defend. Therefore, when we were doing underwriting, and this is a very important thing that we learned when we were doing underwriting, that in a non-duty to defend policy, when an insured asks for heavy deductibles, you don't mind giving him a discount. But if you are doing a duty to defend policy and somebody is trying to cut the premium, he says, no, I can't afford this much premium, cut it down, I'm ready to take a deductible, higher deductible. You know what it means? It means that if he is not willing to pay you the premium just now, and you have given him a higher deductible, how will you recover the deductible from him after you have paid the claimant? So, I mean, it's an essential underwriting tip which Garima will appreciate, but that's the way it works.
See, at the end of the day, we don't want to dispute with a client, but then it shouldn't be something like a general average where you take a guarantee and a counter guarantee. That's the whole issue.
Absolutely.
Ma'am, the next question is where policy mentions specific legal service provider's name, can we assume that coverage is on duty to defend basis?
No, let me answer it both ways. You can't assume. Do not assume. My first thing is do not assume, read. But normally panel counsel endorsement will be given where it is a reimbursement, but the insurer is guiding you that these are the panel counsels. Because you see what happens, in a reimbursement type of policy, you have appointed the lawyer. You have at the end of the whole litigation, you are going to present the defense costs and you're going to present the damages. Damages, because it's a court verdict, the insurer may not argue with. But the arguments start where? The argument starts about reasonable cost of defense. Now, if you want to have this argument, it's fine. Otherwise, go to the panel counsel whom the insurer is recommending, because these panel counsels or this list of lawyers, the insurer already has had a discussion. He knows that he knows the pattern of their charging the fees. So in a way, it helps you to go to that panel. Now comes the question that if you have a lawyer you really trust and you really like, and he's not in the panel, go have this conversation with the insurer, because normally they put a panel counsel when it's reimbursement type of wording. In a duty to defend, they are only handling it. Why would they put a panel?
Right, ma'am. Ma'am, the next question is, would burden of proof differ in duty to defend policy versus duty to indemnify policy?
Lovely question. Burden of proof. Now, again, what is classic? I see such a variance in what is a theory and what is a practice in this particular issue. Normally, in a duty to defend, the whole claim is handled by the insurer. So the insurer has to figure out whether the claim sticks. When I say sticks, as in whether his insured has been really, he'll be held legally liable or not. So in a way, the insurer helps you to discharge the burden of proof, helps the insured to discharge the burden of proof. In a reimbursement policy, no question, you have to discharge the burden of proof. So yes, there is a difference. Unfortunately, in India, I often see that insurers who have granted the duty to defend also expect the insured to charge the burden of proof, which I don't always agree. Classic theory, duty to defend, the insurer discharges the duty to defend. So, and I'm telling you that abroad you will find wording like, even if the claim be false, fraudulent, irrelevant. groundless. Those are the wording in the insurance policy. So obviously, when the insurer is taking on the duty to defend, he is discharging or helping the insured considerably in discharging the burden of proof. But in India, I'm not seeing that. The surveyor still asks that where is this claim falling in the whole policy? What is this?
Ma'am, the next question is, does duty to defend mean surrender of defense of rights by the insured?
Sorry, Garima, you'll have to repeat.
Ma'am, the next question says, does duty of defend mean surrender of defense rights by the insured?
Absolutely. No question. You're surrendering the defense rights. So there are times when I tell the insured, I explain to them and say, you sure you understand, right? That if there is a claim, you've got a duty to defend wording and you will hand over the entire claim to the insurer, which is what was there in my pros and cons also.
Yes, ma'am.
That you can't, in a duty to defend, you have to give notice of each and every claim to the insurer, and you are in effect surrendering your rights to defend yourself.
Ma'am, there is a question that if a claim is handled by the insured and of course the claim lasts for a long time, can the insured request or ask the insurer to take over?
That means that he has had a reimbursement policy and then he is
Yes.
wanting to surrender his right. Depends on the insurer entirely if he wants to take over. He can invoke his right, nothing wrong. But
Yes, it will, yes, ma'am.
yeah,
It will
it will all
depend upon
depend.
how the
Uh,
insurer reacts to it.
Absolutely.
Ma'am, there is another question on the deductible, probably coming from where we discussed earlier, that in a duty to defend, won't the deductible be paid by the insured to insurer?
Yes. If the payment of claim is on behalf, and or normally they will deduct it from the defense costs. But if they have making a payment on behalf of the insured to the third party claimant, then they will have to pay the whole amount. Then the insurer can't deduct it from the third party claimant's claim, can he? So he will deduct it from the defense costs. Abroad, there is no 64 VB. He can deduct it from the premium. We have seen them deduct from the premium of the policy.
Right, ma'am. Ma'am, there's a question that under duty to defend, won't there be an ambiguity in settlement in case of insured versus insureds, especially when the final adjudication will come much later?
Conflict of interest. So now, in most, so insured versus insured is a typical D&O issue. And therefore, most times the D&O policies are reimbursement policies. They are not duty to defend. They are always given on a reimbursement basis of handling, that when the claim comes to the insured or the insured person, against the company if you have given the entity covers, or against the individual directors and officers, then they handle it and claim the defense cost and the damages from the insurer when this whole thing is over. So coming back to the question, insured versus insured. Okay, even in the reimbursement, there is no duty to defend given on D&O policies. Even in the reimbursement policy wording of the D&O, most policies will have that normally if the cause of action is one defense lawyer will be permitted to be appointed by the insured person. But where there are conflict of interest issues, where severability and conduct become, are at the bone of contention, then you are entitled to appoint different legal counsel, but you need to take the insurance company's permission prior to doing so, and you have to convince them of it, in which case they normally allow.
Okay, ma'am. How is duty to defend discharged in case of co-insurance?
Lead insurer.
Lead insurer, yes. So here, if you're a co-insurer, you're a follower, and you have agreed to follow the leader, and the leader is giving to defend, then of course the followers will have to accept, and they have accepted it, and then they will have to follow that. And the next question is duty to defend separate from duty to indemnify.
Yes.
Yes.
Duty to indemnify is paying to the insured. I'm only indemnifying you for the defense cost, but I'm not defending you. Duty to defend means duty to defend. I will defend you if there is a claim. That so abroad, there is nothing such thing as reimbursement wording. It will be called non-duty to defend or duty to indemnify wording.
Ma'am, there is one more question. Right to defend and duty to defend, is it the same thing?
Nope. Right to defend and duty to defend comes in the same line, and this is where most people get confused. So it's a brilliant question, because every time the insurer wants to use duty to defend, he will say it is my right as well as my duty to defend you. What does he mean? He means that, listen, you have accepted a duty to defend policy. Now tomorrow you change your mind. I have quoted the premium based on duty to defend. Tomorrow you change your mind and you say, no, now Mr. Insurer, you please keep away, I want to handle this claim. Then the insurer will say, hang on, you may absolve me from my duty, you may absolve me from the discharge of my duty, but now I'm invoking my right, so I will only defend you.
And ma'am, the last question is, can you shed some light on sunrise and sunset clause?
Not today, because that is a separate topic. It will be done when we are doing the. So look, like I said, that if you appreciate this kind of a debate and discussion, we will continue this series, and we are going to do a specific topic on claims on occurrence basis, and claims on policies on claims made and occurrence basis. This question rightly falls under that. Let me explain the pros, cons, differences between these two, and we promise to take the question at that point of time.
So thank you, ma'am. These were all the questions that we have received.
I think
would
we have
like
overshot our time, but I guess it's all for
yes,
the good.
ma'am. And it has been a very, very interactive session. I would like to thank everybody who has joined in. And we will continue with this series for sure. And we have some very, very interesting topics coming up. Like ma'am mentioned, with respect to, sunrise, sunset clause, occurrence, claims made basis, do's and don'ts in an event of a claim, how to read a contractual mandate, etc. And we would request all of you to please continue with your enthused participation. Also, we will be giving, of course, telling in advance when the next session is going to be. Going forward, if you wish to send your questions earlier on, please feel free to do that. We will try to incorporate it in the session as well. Otherwise, this format also works perfectly fine. So really looking forward to having you all in our next session. Thank you so
I
much.
think, Garima, there's just one gentleman who is sort of a late question. Can we take
Sure,
it?
ma'am. Absolutely, ma'am. If anybody wishes to ask a question, please do so.
Raj Sunil, I think there was a question.
Yeah, I've got a question. I just want to know one thing. Suppose we have given a product liability policy.
Yes.
Now, and with a duty defend or indemnity policy, means where we indemnify the expenses, legal expenses. Now, at what point of time we come to know whether we have to defend this guy or not? Because many a times there are ambiguities whether this particular loss is falling within the purview of the policy or not. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Again, let me answer it in a manner. So, see, I'll tell you where I come from. When I do a master class, I have to stick to theory. But reality is so much different from theory. You got to forgive me if I if I'm going from one to the other. So let me first explain what I would consider the theory, and then we'll look at practice.
Okay.
One thing, you have a product liability policy. So before even incepting or paying the check to the insurer, make sure that you know whether it's a duty to defend or it's an indemnity policy. Okay. In the reimbursement type of policy, duty to indemnify or duty to defend. If it's a duty to defend policy, classic theory of duty to defend, I repeat, you have to send a notice of claim to the insurer. The insurer on his end sees whether it falls into product liability. If it doesn't fall into product liability at all, if it's a managerial issue, he is then justified in telling you